Raftel is underwater. How come no one has been able to stumble across it in just 800 years without use of all 4 road poneglyphs? Well, maybe it's because it isn't immediately visible to someone on the surface, that you could reach the end of the Grand Line, be up against Reverse Mountain, and still not be able to see it because unlike every other island, Raftel relies on a third axis, verticality, to be found. The majority of the world is just ocean, and the probability of you diving down at any random spot in the world and just happening to find it is so astronomically low. Hence the need for coordinates in the form of the road poneglyphs to locate the specific point that Raftel is found, so that you can then submerge and find the island. This is further evidenced by the fact that both the ex-Roger pirates that we've met who have been into Raftel have been preparing for an underwater world, with Rayleigh being a master in coating ships and Crocus refurbishing the inside of Laboon. So why in universe is Raftel underwater? Because the reason for Fishman Island being underwater is because fishmen, since long before the Void Century, have always been discriminated against, and Fishman Island underwater was the only place they could feel the light of the sun in peace without threat of being attacked by humans. Raftel, on the other hand, assuming it was the ancient kingdom, was once the dominant power in the world, and thus its citizens would have no reason to hide. Assuming it was a dominant power, then designing it to be underwater would make it super hard to get in and out of for no reason, assuming it's a similar situation to Fishman Island. And assuming Joy Boy, the sun god, was the leader of the ancient kingdom, why would he design his kingdom to be 10 kilometers under the ocean, the darkest part of the world, instead of on the surface where it could feel the full breadth of the sun's light? That's because it wasn't initially designed to be underwater, and rather was sunk later on. By who? Well, by the world government, the organisation who are described by Dr. Clover to be the known enemy of the ancient kingdom, who rose to the world's dominant power immediately following the ancient kingdom's disappearance, and thus were likely the ones that defeated them. Every island with deep ties to the ancient kingdom, essentially every country with a poneglyph, are all in some way built to resist being sunk by the ocean. Skypiea and Zoe are both high in the clouds, Wano and Alabana are elevated above sea level, Fishman Island is already underwater, and even O'Hara has a giant tree which people can go to the top of. What's interesting is that Joy Boy wrote in the Fishman Island poneglyph that he had already failed the Mermaid Princess, despite still being alive to write the poneglyph, meaning that by the time Joy Boy was writing the poneglyphs he had already suffered a considerable enough loss that caused him to definitively say that it was hopeless, although that loss wasn't his own death. So what could this loss be? Well, how about his kingdom, Raftel, already being destroyed, or at least made inaccessible by having been sunk beneath the waves? Now, the method the world government used to actually sink the island is the topic of another video, and this video has already gone on long enough. So why do I think Raftel is under Reverse Mountain specifically? Well, every arc in One Piece has an inversion, and the inversions normally happen at basically the opposite side of the world to their counterparts. Alabasta and Dressrosa both come early into their respective halves of the Grand Line, both feature a warlord who wants to take over a founding nation by usurping its king. The population of the islands have come to hate the old king through the warlord's trickery, yet the old king retains his love for those people regardless. There is a princess with a dead mum who has been trained from an early age in combat, now attempting to fight against the warlord for the old monarchy to return, and for her people's true freedom. Initially an enemy to Luffy, but quickly coming round to him, their alliance being what pushes Luffy to personally go against the warlord and defeat him in a public display, which finally turns the country's people against him. After which, the old good monarchy is restored, the people's lives have returned to normality, and the old warlord loses his status and is sent to Impel Down. Both arcs also feature a high-level marine who starts hunting them down, but ultimately over the course of the arc decides not to pursue the Straw Hats because they realise the warlord, who they already started off wanting to rid the status of, was actually far worse than Luffy despite his government position. Both arcs also feature Luffy's brother with the Flame Fruit who gives them a Vivre card at the end. Zoe is an island high in the sky that requires a unique method to get up to, that features the ruins of an ancient city and lore heavily tied to the Void Century, as well as a villain that Luffy ultimately doesn't defeat by the end of the arc. Whole Cake Island primarily features a rescue the crewmate plot, the crewmate in question being coerced into leaving the Straw Hats due to connections from their mysterious past, going into the belly of the beast of a much larger organisation than anything the Straw Hats can deal with, the head of which Luffy doesn't even defeat by the end of the arc, instead fighting their number 2. And rather than the end being victorious, the Straw Hats only managed to narrowly escape the much larger fleet of this organisation, which despite having done massive damage to their stronghold, is still very much alive and kicking. Wano's main villain is a horned dude with ties to Wano, who while still strong has had all their hope and ambition crushed out of them by a fight many years ago, which resulted in the destruction of their crew, and who now wants to become Pirate King off the labour of others. Zoro's plotline relates to Ryuma and his sword, Sanji's plotline involves an invisible guy, the climax revolves around the rising of the sun, and Luffy in the title of one of the chapters of the arc is referred to as the warrior of something. Oh, and the Egghead arc prominently features Vegapunk. All these inversions between arcs coincide roughly with where they are on the Grand Line, with Thriller Bark being very close to Marijua, and while we don't know precisely where Wano is, it marks the beginning of the final saga, and it's been a similar number of arcs and also real-life years between the start of the New World and Wano as it was between the start and end of Paradise. And judging by the fact that the time Paradise took, and the time the New World will eventually take, is roughly the same, we can assume that all arcs with an inversion are similarly at inverse points on the globe, just like Alabasta and Dressrosa were. So with all of that being said, what is Fishman Island's inversion? Because if we're following the pattern of all the other pairs of inverse islands so far, Fishman Island's one should also be at the inverse end of the globe to itself. And where was Fishman Island located? In a gap in the red line at the bottom of the ocean under Marijua. Marijua, one of the two key points in the red line, the other being Reverse Mountain, at the opposite end of the globe. See where I'm going with this? Is it really so hard to imagine that the world government, who likely themselves actually created the red line and likely purposefully allowed for the gap for Fishman Island to exist to continue the suppression of fishmen, could simply make another gap at the bottom of the red line somewhere else, only this time at the opposite end of the world, under the other significant structure of the red line, to preserve the ancient kingdom? You may ask why they'd bother to preserve it at all and not just destroy it completely, and I do have a better answer that I'll likely explain in a future video, but for now all I have to say is that why is Raftel still allowed to exist in any capacity, regardless of whether it's under Reverse Mountain or not? Considering the various methods the world government have in their arsenal to completely destroy an island, Raftel being under Reverse Mountain isn't made any less likely than any other theory explaining where Raftel is, because the question of why the world government haven't just destroyed it applies equally to all of them. If anything, the idea that Raftel is under Reverse Mountain does answer this question in part because, if for whatever reason they are unable or unwilling to destroy it, hiding it about 10 kilometers deep at the bottom of the ocean in a tiny sliver of an indestructible wall is just about the next best option. In fact, the dichotomy of Marijua, the home of the world government, being at the centre of the world on the red line at the furthest point above sea level, and the ancient kingdom it took over from and now works to suppress, being at the centre of the world on the opposite end of the globe, also in the red line at the furthest point below sea level, is something that can't be understated. It's great on the thematic level, but it also makes sense in-universe for the world government to decide to do this, putting their base of operations at the furthest point possible from their old enemy. You can even make the connection between Marijua at one end, representing the world government, and Reverse Mountain at other, representing piracy. And there's so many other connections you can make with this idea. Firstly, you have the parallel of how people come into Fishman Island and Raftel, both being through the resin coating. I know this is how people get into Raftel for a fact, simply because that's how any ship gets underwater, and if Raftel is underwater, it would be no different. And so it doesn't help that Rayleigh, the only person we've ever actually seen to be able to coat a ship, was also a former member of Roger's crew who went with them to Raftel. The reason I think this strengthens the idea for Raftel being under Reverse Mountain is because it strengthens the parallels, or rather inversions, between what we now know to be the Fishman Island arc and what we can work out will be included in the Raftel arc. Both arcs will feature the resin coating used to get to their respective islands, and we know that, in the case of Fishman Island, the destination they used the rubber coating to get to was a gap in the red line at the bottom of the sea. Therefore, we can assume that Raftel is also a gap in the red line at the bottom of the sea, which would further strengthen the parallel between the two arcs. You also have the fact that the two poneglyphs that mention Joy Boy are both in Fishman Island and Raftel. There's also the parallel of the crew coming out of Fishman Island, accompanied by a bunch of island whales, as Brooke plays Bink Sake. Two things we know are going to happen when the crew comes out of Raftel. Again, why not strengthen the parallel even further by also making Raftel an island in the gap in the red line, yada yada. There's also the fact that every pirate in the world who comes to the Grand Line with dreams of finding the One Piece and becoming Pirate King is the closest they'll ever get to it at the very start of their journey. Or, what about the lode poneglyphs? We know that there are 4 lode poneglyphs that each describe a location somewhere in the world, and at the centre of these 4 locations is found Raftel. And yet we're now firmly in the final saga, and we don't even know where one of these locations are, let alone have all 4 lode poneglyphs. Where could these locations be, and why even have 4? If you know Raftel's in the centre of all the locations, then surely 2 would be enough, or 3 or 5. Why 4? Well, what if all 4 lode poneglyphs each describe one of the 4 blues? and that at the centre of these 4 locations, i.e. at the centre of the world, literally located at the centre of a giant X, as the silhouette in chapter 820 shows, Raftel is found. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is my favourite part of this theory. It's a classic feature of pirate stories to have a treasure map, with a big red X marking the spot for the location of the buried treasure. And, I guess aside from Buggy, we've yet to see a prominent example of this core feature of pirate mythology make a significant appearance in the series. And yet, here we have a giant X on the red line slap bang in the middle of every map of the world you've ever seen in the series. The biggest X marks the spot, marking the location of the world's biggest buried pirate treasure this world has ever known. But the thing that sealed the deal for me, and should for you if you haven't been already, is the very logo of One Piece itself. Not this one, but the other one. The one that appears as the second shot of the anime ever, directly after the first, that being a map. A writing of the words One Piece, literally showing a big ass red circle with a red X through the middle of it. Our very first hint to its namesake's location.